But I have to stop at the 90s because something happened. Something happened to the fictive escape itself. Something killed it. I guess the question now becomes, what killed it? I think the question is a little misleading, a little unfair. To assume that there is one thing that killed the fictional age isn't entirely accurate. In fact, depending on who you talk to, it may vary due to a variety of factors. However, if Japanese apocalypticism reflects the cultural malaise or attempts to challenge ongoing issues, then a useful question would be, what issues are there for Japanese apocalyptic texts to draw upon? Though the mid-90s is incredibly diverse and dynamic, when we get to Japanese apocalypticism, there are arguably three major events. The first major puncture is the burst. In the mid-90s, the acid bubble price collapse that arguably began in 1986 had begun to take its toll. Traditionally, the idea of being employed for life and retiring began to lose ground, leading to the introduction of temporary workers. Wages began to stagnate, and accounting for inflation, real wages began to fall. This is the first of what could be considered the erosion of what we might consider confidence in the middle ground, or what Benedict Anderson might call an imagined community. Here, confidence in the economy and larger society as a whole would, to the average Japanese citizen, seem like it failed to bulwark against this catastrophe.
When the bust came, and Japan's overinflated speculative bubble popped, the impact on Japanese politics, society, and culture, not to mention its economy, was little short of devastating.
The second incident is the 1995 Great Hanshin Earthquake, or the Kobe Earthquake. On January 17, 1995, the Great Hanshin Earthquake measured a 7.2 on the Richter scale, hitting the Hyogo Prefecture. With 5,200 deaths, 30,000 injured, 300,000 homeless, and 110,000 buildings damaged, the Great Hanshin Earthquake was, at the time, the most devastating earthquake to hit Japan since the Great Kanto Earthquake in 1923. This is the second major incident to affect the Japanese psyche and, according to Masaji Osawa, the first natural disaster to emphasize a cruelty of nature. After all, if the prerogative of the fictional age was to work, be industrious, and establish your sense of belonging and being in the fantasy world, then what happens when it all comes quite literally crashing down? How does the fictive escape stop or temper the very real consequences of the Hanshin quake? The third event occurred on March 20th, 1995. Toting bags of impure sarin, high-ranking members of the Shinshin Shukyo group Om Shinrikyo released the gas using sharpened umbrella tips on subway trains. The attack killed 12 and injured up to 5,000. The leader of the group, Shoko Asahara, had himself regularly cast apocalyptic visions, and through Om's own publications like the Vadriana, some of them drew from anime like Nausicaa Valley of the Wind and Space Battleship Yamano. Om's totalistic belief is notable since, as Robert Lifton states, for the first time in history, end-time religious fanaticism allied itself with weapons capable of destroying the world, and a group embarked on the mad project of doing just that. In fact, the Om Shinrikyo attack is something I'm going to cover in another video because while it's difficult to precisely pin down the causal mechanisms of Om's attack and its effect on anime and manga, studying Om's effects is essential to studying a post-1995 anime and manga landscape. But I digress. To Osawa, this is a critical distinction for the death knell of the fictional age because not only did Om's material heavily draw upon anime and manga, but Om's own position as a Japanese cult provided a third specter. Whereas the bubble burst is a loss of confidence in the stability of the economy and the earthquake was a loss of confidence in the stability of the government, Om's attack was a loss of confidence in the stability of the national identity. All of them were necessary communal spaces. All of them, in the span of only a few years, effectively began to collapse. This was the beginning of what Osawa calls Fukanose no Jidai, or the Age of Impossibility, a time where people have now begun to fictionalize reality not to escape it, but rather because there seemed no sense to a sense of the real. It all seemed like a bad joke, a dream state. After all, what can you believe in? What's out there to support you? Isn't it just better to retreat? It can't possibly be happening. What can you do? That was Japan's zeitgeist, as strange as it was. And that's precisely the zeitgeist that watched Anno Hideaki and Gainax's monumental apocalyptic tale. Neon Genesis Evangelion. Airing from October 4th, 1995 to March 27th, 1996, Evangelion revolves around a 14-year-old boy named Shinji Ikari whom, at the summon of his father, ends up piloting a biomechanical robot known as an Eva against unknown beings known as angels. Over the course of the story, he is introduced to fellow pilots Rei Ayanami and Asuka Langley. The show has a fairly straightforward plot for the first half, focusing on a fairly noticeable grand narrative that wouldn't be out of place in the sort of 70s or 80s mecha climate. However, in episode 16, it begins to take a shift to an inwards look at the characters, starting with Shinji and his experience in the space by the angel Lilio. As the episodes progress, it culminates with the unfurling of the Human Instrumentality Project and ultimately Shinji's decision. Evangelion, in short, is very Lacanian in nature, though we can see some very overt references to Freud, the most notable being episode 20 titled Oral Stage. I think Evangelion is more easily understood through the perspectives of Lacanian psychoanalysis, particularly through basic fundamental Lacanian terms like the real, symbolic, and imaginary. Now, I'm going to be simplifying for the sake of the video here, so my apologies on the lack of precision. The imaginary is the conception of being, the us and perceived us, for instance, who I am and what people believe I am. The symbolic is the connective system that allows me to relate to someone else's imaginary. For instance, I imagine myself as a YouTuber making an argument, and you may imagine yourself as a watcher consuming that argument. The words and visuals I use are cropped up by a system that we both share upon which I can communicate with you to make my point. The real, and this is a very, very massive oversimplification, is essentially the force that exists outside of that communication that we can't expect. In fact, Slovenian psychoanalyst Slavoj Zizek has a fantastically straightforward illustration of the Lacanian triad. In a chess game, the pieces themselves are the imaginary. They are constitutions of being, but ultimately may change appearance and label. The symbolic is the rule set, the communicative language that empowers, restricts, and defines the pieces. A knight, Zizek argues, can only move in a certain way. The real, therefore, is the constitution of elements outside of the game's formal components. The players, the intrusions, etc. They don't come with the game of chess, so the formal components have no way of expecting what is going to happen. So why is understanding this triad important to understanding Evangelion and, more broadly, 90s Japanese apocalyptic anime? Because, while arguably, the symbolic has begun to disintegrate, Motoko Tanaka notes the usefulness of the Lacanian lens, stating that a close relationship belongs to the world of the imaginary, and a far-off abstract issue such as the end of the world belonging to the world of the real. Cultural critic Azuma Hiroki himself makes the connection in that the dissolution of the communal space or the imagined community can be considered akin to the weakening of the Lacanian symbolic. In short, we could consider the nations, governments, and organizations that connect the small personal relationships that exist to a catastrophe that's happening in the backdrop to be the mediation. Now, some of you might already pick up on a major note. If the nations and states are representative of the symbolic, what is nerve? What's seal? Who is the admiral? What do they represent? Well, therein lies the distinction. Evangelion isn't a perfect example of a disintegration of the symbolic, but rather it's important because it's the progenitor. Tanaka mentions that society as we can understand it in Eva is there but ultimately insignificant. We can find this in Shinji asking exactly why they fight, showing that a sense of right and wrong, good or bad, have not been fully realized. And while we can link nerve and seal to elements of the symbolic, they aren't particularly normative agents themselves. Seal's machinations are oftentimes obscured through its fairly cryptic language, and nerve's intentions and reasons for cooperating with Seal don't really unfurl until the last few episodes and in the end of Evangelion. Though we can find the role that nations play in Asuka's introduction, the Admiral and the fleet end up being secondary to Shinji and Asuka's cooperation in defeating the Angel. In fact, while Evangelion is an imperfect destabilization of the communal space, it is very important in that it does heavily focus on individual conceptualization. The first definitive marker of Shinji's identity, in fact, comes from his instrumentality as a pilot. After all, Shinji's identity is formed directly by Gendo wanting his son to pilot Eva 1, which, as Charles Dwan comments, is notable because just as Lacan's father determines the identity of symbols, Ikara Gendo determines the identity of his son. In this context, we can see Gendo as an almost literal manifestation of signifiers onto an identity. And we can see how over the course of Evangelion, identity is formed through these incredibly tight personal relationships. The efforts of Nerve are actorized by the classroom onto Shinji, which is then juxtaposed through its disdain. Toji himself actorized Nerve as Shinji, beating him up for the disaster. When Shinji runs away in episode 4, he really lacks clarity in terms of who he is outside of his status as a pilot. In fact, the act of fighting itself has a highly inwards personal dimension to it. Yui, as the creator of Eva 1, is involved in a union with Shinji through their synchronization. The angels themselves function as the real other, but the nature of the Evas themselves are biomechanical fusing stemming from the angels. The conflict is, by its nature, inherently internalized. And this is exactly how Evangelion framed apocalyptic texts that's worth noting. Shinji, if we consider him the nexus of understanding, crafts his identity from notable close first-order relationships. He almost always knows or has an understanding of people that end up affecting him. Nerve just happens to be run by his father. Eva 1 just happens to have been built by his mother. The rogue Eva just happens to be one of his close friends. The final angel is someone who just happens to establish a close rapport to him. He just happens to live with his superior and a fellow pilot. When Shinji's inner world is examined, we find that his understanding of who he is and how people think of him, his imaginary, if you will, is constructed by tight, immediately notable bonds. In the end of Evangelion, Shinji focuses on Rei and Kaworu amidst a faceless sea of ultimately unimportant people. In short, there are very few instances of mediation in the story, and you can find a notable poignant brevity to the show. The world is hardly bustling or busy. When you contrast it to an 80s apocalyptic text like Akira, you can find a massive, meaningful network of people who oscillate between multiple orders of meaningfulness, people who come and go with the camera cutting with action to reaction to assemble a sense of density, of weight to society. But that's not what we see in Evangelion. The malaise of society is the malaise of Shinji himself, of Asuka herself, of Rei, of Gendo. Their personal problems have thus been intertwined with the fate of the world. This is important because the failure of the symbolic or the lack of the symbolic is itself where we can arguably find instances of the real. For instance, a war can be where the symbolic order failed, where the rules and expectations of behavior can itself lead to a disintegration of governance or diplomacy. Stephanie Thomas makes a very good point in the last TV episode of Evangelion, noting that the narrative moves on to Shinji's lack of self-definition, all other characters explaining to him in turns that he is shaped both by his own mind as well as the world around him, and that he cannot understand himself in a world that contains no one but him. It thereby implies that to exist in the world depends on shifting identities influenced not only by yourself, but also by those around you. That to exist is to have people know you exist. This dynamic plays out in the movie as well. The loss of the personal AT field in End of Evangelion is itself a literal loss of the symbolic, where borders that have thus been constructed for disparate senses of the imaginary no longer exist. After all, the Human Instrumentality Project would remove anxiety, suffering, and refusal, where the imaginary becomes singular and thus no symbolic is needed. Human boundaries and definitions would thereby no longer remain. But who emerges out of it? Well, it's Shinji, and just as importantly, Asuka, because to define yourself isn't simply what you think you are, but what others think of you, and thus Asuka's presence is necessary for Shinji's full conceptualization of the self. Shinji's action and why he chokes Asuka is not only a callback to the inner world scene, but it establishes the last major internal conflict. Shinji chokes Asuka out of a fear of rejection of his identity, whatever that may be. However, Asuka responds, but her scathing response stresses the reality of identity formation. It stresses that attempting to connect with others, even if it is at the risk of rejection and harm, is necessary. And that's really interesting. because through emphasizing the incredibly close relationship juxtaposed with massive shifts or catastrophes, we have the introduction of a new type of storytelling, a byproduct of the Japanese senses of the 90s. We have the Sekai-kei, the world story. So what are Sekai-kei? Well, we don't really have a precise definition. Stephanie Thomas has done an incredibly thorough outlining of various definitions of Sekai-kei, noting that several Japanese cultural critics have different metrics and measurements for what it is. For instance, Kasai Kiyoshi defines it as a group of work in which the male protagonist and heroine have a personal relationship alongside a large problem like a world crisis. In comparison, Satoshi Maejima in his book What is Sekai-kei notes the difficulty of defining it, but nevertheless describes it as a small story between a boy and a girl, a story where the girl fights but the boy doesn't, and the end of the world threat is opaque. Uno Tsunehiro defines it as a series of otaku-type works which remove concepts such as society and nation while extending one's own feelings or self-consciousness to perceive them on the scope of the world. Christopher Howard extends that definition by adding on to the school as a socialization and what he calls the protective sensation of moe as relationship rather than anything particularly sexual. Miyadai Shinji defines the Sekai-kei as school day or domestic dramas that are confined to the protagonist's inner world. In a talk with Kaiichiro Morikawa moderated by Takashi Murakami, Gainax co-founder Toshio Okada defines Sekai-kei as narratives where personal feelings are weighted evenly with the fate of the world. In short, Sekai-kei is prone to imprecise definitions. However, and this is important, most people agree on what defines quintessential Sekai-kei fiction. Most of the scholars I noted all agree, save for Morikawa, that Eva is a preliminary, malformed Sekai-kei fiction at best, but it stands as sort of a grandfather fiction, whereas pieces like Saika no Iria no Sora UFO no Natsu and Hoshi no Koi are considered quintessential Sekai-kei works. Now, given the definitions, you can find that some of these pieces don't fit entirely well. For instance, Iria no Sora has some exposure to the symbolic middle ground. In Saika no, Shuji is actively involved in the war. In Hoshi no Koi, the main relationship has no major linkage to the large abstract problem. So let's change the question a bit. What is it in service to? What is the sensibility that the Sekai-kei piece is attempting to capture, and exactly what is it saying? We can make the comparison to Akira. When we look at Akira, the focus is on mapping a Japanese cultural sensibility that is presented with temporal insignificance. As a pastiche of various influences, Akira's apocalyptic question is to set up the context of this is who we are, what defines us, and through the catastrophe, ultimately state this is what's worth preserving. The ruinous nature of Neo-Tokyo upholds the power of narrative that major institutional structures depend on the crafting of these intersubjective linkages between the people that craft the future. However, when we shift to Sekai-kei, the question can be broadly understood as this is what happened to us, and this is how we deal with them. In that context, the close relationships of Sekai-kei fiction being situated in a school setting, the local settings, the interlocking of close relationships and major abstract issues presents a way of understanding the world through a hyper-imaginary lens. Everything is constructed, even the world itself. If you die, the world dies, and we can see those reflected in these definitive Sekai-kei pieces. The war in Saika no is never really explicitly defined, but rather acts as a match to the very personal issues ongoing. The elaboration on exactly how the war is understood is unclear, mitigating the symbolic connection. Similar vibes are visible in Hoshi no Koi and Iria no Sora. In Hoshi no Koi, Noboru and Mikako's relationship dominates what is an otherwise implied catastrophe. Iria no Sora is a particularly interesting case because Akiyama Mizuhito made it as a direct response to Evangelion, with Thomas noting that Mizuhito deliberately conceptualized his light novel series as UFO Ayanami, i.e. he wrote a narrative in which a girl resembling the most popular Evangelion character pilots a UFO and fights. All of them focus on girls that fight. In Saika no, Chise is the one who fights. In Hoshi no Koi, Mikako is the one who fights. In Iria no Sora, Iria is the one that fights. As an imperfect Sekai-kei piece, Evangelion has male and female fighters, but Shinji's dependence on the female figures at moments nevertheless stresses the female fighter in both a girlfriend-mother condition. Tanaka defines them as others in the Lacanian term, which is the source of love, something that plays a role in ego formation. But again, what service is this particular story type? What is it addressing? Uno Tsunohiro notes in his book The Imagination of the 2000s that Sekai-kei fiction as a result of the socio-cultural changes can be understood as withdrawal fiction. Tsunohiro compares Shinji's withdrawal as recollective of the hikikomori. In this context, Sekai-kei stories can be considered apocalyptic settings that focus on withdrawal, particularly into realms of the pure imaginary. In fact, Tomoki Saito makes an incredibly useful distinction in Beautiful Fighting Girl, stating that the reason a character like Rei is so beloved is because she represents a phallic girl, a girl that Saito notes represents a total lack of material existence. Saito then goes on to note that while what he calls a Western space tries to anchor fiction in reality to some perspective, a Japanese space does not insist on that anchor. In other words, Ayanami to the Japanese otaku exists as a purely fictionalized force that represents the complete loss of the symbolic. She's a purely imaginary force. And that's why Sekai-kei fiction is so interesting in the context of the apocalypse. Japanese apocalypticism up until now conceived of the end of the world in some sense of anchoring, reflecting social senses that are in turn highly reflective of strong symbolic orders. However, for Sekai-kei fiction, particularly Sekai-kei apocalyptic fiction, the catastrophe is purely internalized. Rei is valuable because she exists as a pure insert of the reader's imaginary exercise, and that exercise is valuable because it, as Christopher Howard notes, helps overcome the otaku viewer's supposed anxiety over the sense of loss experience and successful symbolic integration. Therefore, this loss of confidence is because in the real world, to many Japanese, it seemed to have failed. Sekai-kei fiction juxtaposes close relationships with broad catastrophes because that is the form broad social failure was registered in the early to mid-90s. Close personal relationships, broad catastrophe, failures of the in-between. Tanaka notes that the attraction of Sekai-kei works is related to the phenomenon of acute social withdrawal known as hikikomori that began to be recognized as a serious social problem in Japan in the late 1990s. In addition to the rise of the NEETs and Frieders, it would seem that the maturation of Japanese society seemed impossible for an increasing number of Japanese youth. But again, what does Sekai-kei ultimately say? Well, it depends on who you talk to. Tanaka believes that Sekai-kei works satisfy the desire of omnipotence by allowing their protagonists to indirectly control the world through their empowered girlfriends and negate the experiences of resignation, refusal, and loss. Komori Kentaro shares a similar sentiment, equating effort with growth, and in contrast, Sekai-kei protagonists do not grow up, forge friendships, or win. Summed up simply, they do not become adults. But is that what happens in Evangelion? Is it a story of Shinji not growing up? Of him unable to connect to the symbolic order? I think it depends on what you've registered in that last scene, what all that suffering stands for. I think that despite its bleak perspectives, Evangelion, like the Sekai-kei fiction it influenced, has an ultimately rough but optimistic outlook on life. It stands as a means of understanding not only the people who grew up in a social order that to them completely robbed them of meaning, but it also stresses an incredibly simple yet brutally honest point. Connection is painful, connection is difficult, connection can lead to suffering and misery and vulnerability, but the alternative may be worse. In this context, in Evangelion, I stand with Thomas's argument. Shinji rejects the merging of humanity because to define yourself also depends on knowing how others have defined you. She says that instrumentality's purpose is to eliminate otherness by fusing all of humanity into one undifferentiated existence. And therefore, Shinji's declaration, his powerful declaration of "I am me, I want to be me," foregrounds how suffering, anguish, and pain comes with self-definition, but regardless stresses that self-definition is vital. And in a time when Japan was seriously battling its own self-definition after several calamities, Evangelion hit on some very sore, painful points about who we were, are, and will become. The story of Evangelion, of Psychoanalytic, of Iria no Sora, of Hoshi no Koi are stories of Kobe, the bubble burst, of Om, and how society's young men and women looked at these issues and asked, where do I go from here? And sometimes the answer to that question can only be what you make of that fiction. Next time, we're going to look at how anime challenged this otherness of Sekai-kei elements, and how it paved the way to anime as we understand it today.